Yeah, I'm part of the European Parliament's research service, and the Climate Action Research Tracking Service CART is a team of 4 people to support the members of the European Parliament with information and analysis in relation to climate change. And it was established 2 years ago after the Parliament declared the climate and environmental emergency. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. All right, the talk has 3 parts. First, it's about the EU's policies to phase out fossil fuels and achieve climate neutrality. Second is about infrastructures for the energy transition. And the third part is about the effects that the Ukraine war and the EU's response to it has had on the transition toward climate neutrality and on energy infrastructure. Next slide, please. The overall plan to achieve climate neutrality, but also other objectives, is the European Green Deal, which is a program to transform the entire EU economy up to 2050 to achieve objectives like climate neutrality, that is net zero greenhouse gas emissions, but also zero pollution, a circular economy, which is considered necessary for achieving the climate neutrality and reducing material and energy needs, a sustainable food system, and all of that together with social justice and fairness and growth and prosperity. The next slide, please. Yeah, this is again a visual representation of the Green Deal program. And as the Green Deal in the middle, then it has those objectives on the side, and then it has also important points below. Financing the transition, which is going to be a big effort. We're talking about trillions of euros here, and leaving no one behind, achieving a just transition, especially for those who, well, for the more vulnerable parts of the population and those dependent on fossil fuel industry. Next slide, please. The whole Green Deal is driven by EU-level targets. And the target that we're dealing with at the moment is to achieve a 55% cut of net emissions by 2030 compared to 1990 levels, which is the fastest emission cut ever, about 3 times faster than what has been done in the past. And this is an intermediate step towards reaching net zero emissions climate neutrality by 2050 and negative emissions after that. And the EU does not have a formal carbon budget, but the carbon budget is implicit in the 3 main EU policies. That is the cap of emissions within the emission trading system. That is the annual emission allocations for the member states under the effort sharing regulation. And that is the commitment to achieve emission reductions in the land use change and forestry sector, the so-called LULUCF. So cutting emissions is one of the pillars. Reduction of energy demand is another pillar, which will help to get away from fossil fuels, because the less energy you consume, the less fossil fuels, of course, you will need. And there the target has been raised, there the target will be raised for another 9% of energy savings compared to the current targets. And the final pillar is, of course, to replace the fossil fuels with renewable energy sources. And there the target has been raised from, will be raised from 32.5% to 40% by 2030. The next slide, please. Member states will play a key role in these efforts because they have the ultimate say on their energy mix. They develop national energy climate plans for that. Next slide. Yeah. Previous, please. The European climate law has been in force since 1 year, and it sets legally binding targets for the emission reduction, sets up a reporting and monitoring framework, and it implements the EU's nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement into EU law. Next slide. Now, what we in the Parliament are dealing with at the moment is the Fit for 55 package, a huge package of legislative proposals to update all of the EU energy and climate legislation to meet this 2030 target. And that means revising the legislation that is actually in force for the 2020 to 2030 period. So it's important to go very fast. It's also important for member states to anticipate what will come out. It's 6 proposals for new legislation, 13 proposals for to revise existing legislation, and it's under the ordinary legislative procedure, which means that the European Parliament and the Council will co-decide. The next slide, please. This is just an overview how complex the Fit for 55 package is. In the middle, you have the legislative proposals. On the right, you see which sectors are affected, the emissions trading system, the effort sharing, and the land use. And on the right, you see that many of those, the red ones at the bottom, they go to energy, but there are also many proposals affecting transport and buildings, which are the sectors which have proved very difficult to reduce emissions so far. Next slide, please. Then there's the question of financing the transition. We're talking here on the order of magnitudes of a trillion euros that will be necessary up to 2030. And this is supported by the EU budget, which will dedicate 30% of it to climate action through mainstreaming across all policy areas. Then there's also a lot of money that goes to climate action in the Next Generation EU, which is EU's response to the COVID crisis. And 37% of that money that member states can get there will have to go to climate action. The European Investment Bank will direct its investments toward climate-friendly activities in the EU and abroad. And the EU Sustainable Finance Strategy will help to mobilize private finance, which will be, of course, the bulk of the finance that is required. Next slide, please. Now to the second part, the infrastructure needs that will first of all affect electricity grids, because a lot of the renewable energy will be electricity or will be green hydrogen, which is also produced with renewable electricity. It will also concern charging stations for electric vehicles to decarbonize the transport sector. And because much of the renewable energy is variable, the wind, the sun, there will be an increased need for energy storage to deal with this variability. And energy storage concerns electricity, but also concerns gas and hydrogen. And there's that concept of sector coupling, converting electricity to gas and hydrogen and vice versa, in order to have a completely carbon-free, emissions-free energy system. There will also be a need for hydrogen network, for carbon capture, utilization and storage in combination with CO2 networks to transport the captured carbon, and low carbon electricity generation, renewable power plants onshore and offshore. Next slide, please. And there are a number of policy instruments for the infrastructure. The most important one is the 10-year network development plan, which is drawn up by the transmission system operators for gas and electricity. And they have this year, for the first time, developed a joint scenario to achieve that sector coupling between the gas sector and the hydrogen and electricity sector. Then there's the Connecting Europe facility, which establishes trans-European networks for energy, so that's gas and electricity infrastructure, and finances PCIs, projects of common European interest. There's the Innovation Fund and Modernization Fund for the energy system, financed from the emissions trading system. Then there's industrial policy, notably the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance to get clean hydrogen development off the ground. And finally, well, let's skip to the next slide, please. Now, the last part, what effects does the Ukraine war and the EU response have on the green low carbon transition and on energy infrastructures? And one reaction of the EU is to impose sanctions on Russia, and that is not only sanctions on persons and the banks, but that's also cutting imports of Russian energy. And that at the moment concerns oil products, where there's a phase-out period to get away from Russian oil. And it also concerns coal and other solid fuels, where Russia also accounts for a large part of the EU imports, and basically a wind down of existing contracts and apply this sanction fully from August 2022. There's also much discussion about cutting imports of Russian gas, but that seems to be very difficult because the EU industry, and notably some countries like Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, are very much dependent on imports of Russian gas and cannot substitute them so easily. So there's rather the opposite fear that Russia may cut off the gas supply in response to European sanctions and leave Europe cold and without industrial production in the winter. And the reaction to that is filling up the EU gas storage before the winter. And that actually means buying as much Russian gas as Russia will deliver at the moment. So there's a dilemma here, wanting to get away from the Russian energy, but needing it to get over the next winter. That gets me to the next slide. And that is the effects, the conflict between short-term and medium, long-term reaction. The short-term actions basically make sure that Europe will have enough energy supplies over the next winter, especially. And that means alternative supplies of fossil fuel, for example, liquefied natural gas from Qatar, pipeline gas from Algeria. But there's also increased talk about domestic production, for example, of oil in the North Sea or in the Mediterranean. And this means that fossil fuels, which were previously considered unburnable, now come back into consideration again, also because the high prices of the energy, of course, completely shift the economic picture here. Then it also means in the short term demand reduction and measures to curb consumer energy prices, which unfortunately in some member states means basically paying consumers so that they can consume more fossil energy by, for example, radically reducing taxes on petrol over the summer. In the medium term, however, it means accelerating the transition to renewable energies, which have been termed freedom energy by the German finance minister, as a way to get away from Russian imports. And now the last slide, please. And there are the impacts on the infrastructure, of course. And unfortunately, this means having to invest in fossil fuel infrastructures to meet the short-term needs for gas that Europe does not want to buy in the future. So that means terminals for importing liquefied natural gas. And unfortunately, that also means concluding long-term contracts with suppliers like Qatar, who don't want to have short-term contracts only. And it also means gas interconnections, for example, between Spain and France, and that without the main European continent, because Spain has been has a lot of LNG terminals to import liquefied natural gas, but there's no way to bring that to the mainland. And there's a hope that that infrastructure that's being constructed now, that has very long lifetimes, that can be converged in the future to be used for green hydrogen. But that is not so clear if that can be, well, how that can be done with the existing infrastructure, because on the one hand, it's only feasible, for example, for power plants to mix a certain part of hydrogen, about half to 70%, but you cannot easily convert the gas power plants to run on 100% hydrogen. And also for gas infrastructure, the issue is that you cannot convert them to hydrogen if they're still needed for gas transport, unless you have a double pipeline and you convert one of the two pipelines to hydrogen, keep the other one for gas. Okay, thank you for your attention.